This week on The Sceptic, I speak to David Shipley, writer on prison reform, on the Southport attack and the serious questions for Keir Starmer and the government about why we were kept in the dark about it for so long.
Now that Keir Starmer has acknowledged this terror link, what's interesting is there's been quite a concerted effort to insist that this couldn't possibly have been disclosed before this point because it might have prejudiced the trial and that sort of thing. And that's just not true.
Fred de Fossard, Director of Strategy at the Prosperity Institute, on how the inauguration of Donald Trump is set to blow a hole in woke capitalism and whether Britain can ever follow suit.
We are regulating our own industries to death by choice, and meanwhile the newly elected President of the United States is trying to do all he can to unleash supply-side reform, cheap energy, deregulation to support American industry. So it's a pretty gloomy time for British observers of ESG. We look across the Atlantic with a lot of jealousy.
And for our premium subscribers, I'm joined by author and historian Ed West on why the fallout of the grooming gang scandal could make it Britain's Chernobyl.
So Chernobyl disaster was about communism, it wasn't about nuclear. It was deeply rooted in how the communist system worked, from the materials they bought, which had a problem, to the cover-up, which made things worse. Likewise, the response to the grooming gangs by police, social workers and other members of the state was very linked to the ruling sort of ideology of our system.
If you're not already a donor, make a donation of at least £5 a month for The Daily Sceptic, log in with the same email, and you'll find a link to the premium version of the podcast on the homepage, including instructions about how to listen to it on your favourite podcasting app. Donors will also be able to access articles behind our paywall and join our discussion threads on Discord, where you'll have an opportunity to discuss the latest Daily Sceptic content with other donors, members of the editorial team, and some of your favourite contributors. You can access all this bonus content for as little as £5 a month. Just go to dailyskeptic.org/donate. Now, on with the show. Hello and welcome to episode 27 of The Sceptic, the Daily Sceptic's weekly podcast. I'm your host, Laurie Wastell, an associate editor at The Daily Sceptic. Now, 3 counts of murder, 10 counts of attempted murder, 1 count of possession of a knife, 1 charge of production of a biological toxin, ricin, 1 charge of possessing information of a kind likely to be useful to a person committing or preparing an act of terrorism, namely a PDF file entitled Military Studies in the Jihad Against the Tyrants, the Al-Qaeda Training Manual. Those are the charges that Axel Rudabakana pleaded guilty to this week, after his vicious and barbaric attack against little children attending a Taylor Swift-themed dance class in Southport last July. By the time you're watching this, Rudabakana will have been sentenced. But serious questions still remain about how this was allowed to happen, and about the government response to the outrage that so understandably followed. And to discuss that, I'm very pleased to be joined back on The Sceptic this week by David Shipley, who's a writer on prison reform for publications including The Spectator. Welcome to The Sceptic, David.
Hi, Laurie. It's good to be back.
Yeah, good to have you back. And so, of course, last time we discussed much of the fallout of the Southport attack and the protests and the people who were being locked up because of it. And we'll get onto some of that later. But so this week, the suspect has pleaded guilty. And that actually came as a bit of a surprise, didn't it? Because it was right at the start of the trial. Just tell us what happened there.
I think it wasn't necessarily entirely unexpected, because at the pre-trial hearing before Christmas, his defence barrister indicated that there was no defence that was going to be presented, and all they were intending to do was challenge the prosecution to prove their case on the charges, which, you know, I think would have raised the question: was there any point in Axel Rudabakana going not guilty? So in some ways, not necessarily surprising. I know there's been a lot of kind of narrative from people saying, we would have found out more about what happened. And I think while there is some truth in that, it may well be a relief for the families to not have to sit through 4 weeks of evidence. And, you know, the guy was clearly and is clearly, guilty as sin. So I can understand why his plea was changed.
And so one of the things that suggested that it was unexpected from the point of view of the court was that none of the families were actually in court to hear him plead guilty, because they hadn't been expecting that day. And why? Tell us about how important that is for the families to hear that.
Yeah, I think I understand the families were in another place being shown some of the footage which was going to be shown in evidence in court, and that's why they weren't attending. So clearly it was unexpected. They wouldn't have been shown that footage. when you speak to victims of crime and the families of victims, often their criticism of the justice system is they just don't really know what's happened or why. And that feeling of not understanding why it happened, it can be really haunting and traumatizing for victims and for their families. So I think the fact they were not able to hear him say guilty is probably quite a negative, particularly given this is the first time he's spoken at any of the hearings. Up until now, he's been silent, and not at any point. The pre-trial hearing, he didn't even confirm his name. His barrister had to enter not guilty pleas on his behalf. So, I think if I were one of the parents of those girls, I would want to have seen him plead guilty.
Right, and so we're actually recording this before his sentencing, but obviously there's the expectation of a very long sentence there, but partly because he's a minor, I think, he's not expected to have a whole life tariff. Can you just explain what that distinction is there?
Yes, so anyone convicted of murder in this country will receive a life sentence. What is termed life sentence? This means they will typically be given a tariff alongside that. So that could be 14 years, 18 years, 22 years, 25 years. And what that means is they would not be eligible to be considered for parole and release until they reach that number of years. And then they would need to apply for parole. Some murderers are given what's called a whole life tariff, and this means there is no opportunity for release. This is perhaps maybe what people would actually consider to be a life sentence. In fact, though, it's not because Rudy Cabana was a minor, it's because he was aged under 21. So if you are under 21 when you commit the offence, you cannot be given a whole life tariff. And I think that is a problem, actually. I do believe in redemption. I have written and spoken about the fact that there are some men I met in prison who had committed murder, who I could see had changed profoundly and had done everything they could to atone for their crimes and work to redeem themselves and change themselves. But when I think about those men, I'm mostly thinking about young men who were involved in gang activity or disputes over territory or money or drugs or a woman with other young men. And I think I find those sorts of murders more understandable. I understand that young men may fight and sometimes young men may kill young men, and that a man who did that 10 or 15 or 20 or 25 years before may have changed. And I can see a path to redemption there in this world. I do not think that is morally the same as a man who went to a dance class where very young girls were dancing joyfully to Taylor Swift songs and went to kill them. I think that kind of offence is one which I do not believe there is any redemption available for people in this life. And I think it is a serious problem here that a court can't award him a whole life tariff, because I do not think that this is not, in my view, someone who should be ever released.
And so, of course, we'll know that by the time this has gone out. But so, obviously, now he's pled guilty. That means that plenty of information about him that couldn't have been released before now can, because there's no trial to prejudice. And one of the key things that's caused controversy is the fact that he was known to prevent. But there's actually quite a lot of information about him that's come out now. I mean, just tell us a bit about some of that, David.
Well, so we know that there was going to be bad character evidence presented from one or more of his school teachers, talking about what he was like at school. We've heard the fact that he was excluded from school. He went back to his school with a knife, that he was considered to be a threat to other pupils. He was referred to prevent, I think, at least 3 times. And there's clearly been really significant failures here. This was a young man who for years, since his early teens, has been showing serious signs that he was a threat. He apparently spoke often about the Rwandan genocide. He was fascinated by genocide. He was fascinated by ideas of violence. This is someone who clearly posed a threat and had had Prevent, had the police, had the school, acted differently and sooner, those girls may well still be alive, and there's been a gross failing here.
Yeah, and so we'll get a bit more into that in a second. But another thing that's come out this week is obviously this mugshot of him, which is very, very disturbing. One of the narratives that there's been for a while is that it's been sort of an indictment, supposedly, of the media. That the only photo they've been able to use of him was this photo of him as a sort of young choir boy, as it's described, looking quite innocent when he's younger. And but that doesn't really stack up, does it? Because this photo was only released recently by the police, of course. So that's not quite right, is it?
Yeah, I attended the pre-trial hearing remotely, and so I watched him during that. I think that photo does convey what he looked like. He was pulling a lot of very, very strange expressions. Kind of was covering his face, uncovering his face, very swaying a lot and moving quite oddly. I think it's not. Sometimes people who aren't familiar with processes like the courts can think that things are suspicious when they're not. But generally, it's not the case that sort of mugshots will be released before conviction or sentencing. If I think about my own trial, no images like that were published of me until I'd been sentenced, I believe, or certainly until I pled guilty. So whether there were other photos available of him or not, I don't think it changes things. That may simply be the photo that was available. I think the more serious and significant issue here, which I'm sure we'll come on to, is how the authorities, up to and including the Prime Minister, communicated about this situation in the days and weeks afterwards.
And so you mentioned seeing him in proceedings online there, and one of the suggestions that's been made about him is that during these he's appeared to be smirking. And what did you see of what his demeanour was in those proceedings? Yeah,
I think when I watched him, he didn't wear a mask, whereas he had worn a mask in previous hearings. He was shifting a lot in his chair, kind of moving around, looked very uncomfortable, very disassociated, But at the same time, in that hearing, his barristers made it clear that there was no psychiatric evidence, no evidence about mental health they were planning to submit. So there was no suggestion that he was not in his right mind when he committed these horrible murders.
Okay, so to pick up on some of those failings then, obviously Keir Starmer has pledged an inquiry now, and that's into Prevent and into other failings of state institutions. But what do you make of that? Is that going to give us the answers we're really looking for?
I think I'm a little cynical about public inquiries. They are often used by the British state to kick something into long grass, have a long inquiry, and says we can't talk about it till the inquiry's over. And then inquiries often produce outcomes where there's no specific blame attached to individuals. There's no real meaningful consequences of people who failed. There are sort of this focus on finding broad institutional learnings, or some equally horrible corporate speak word. I think it is necessary to figure out what went wrong here, because a lot has gone wrong very clearly. But it depends, who's going to lead the inquiry, what are the terms of reference going to be? Will they give it to someone who's going to produce a nice, cosy, quiet assessment, or will it be something that actually addresses what the issues are? I think particularly with Prevent, if you look at the data, their biggest focus seems to be on the one specific ideology they're most focused on is kind of what they call extreme right, and we've seen from the government's rhetoric since the summer that they are very concerned about the extreme right. They see this in the election of Trump. They see this when Elon Musk tweets about them. They see this in the protests and riots after Southport. And if you look at the actual data about fatal terrorist and extremist acts, say over the last 10 or 15 years, they are not primarily or even mostly committed by members of the far right, however drawn. I think the only big obvious example is the murder of Joe Cox. In fact, most of these attacks seem to be Islamist or Islamist adjacent. I know there's a discussion with Rudy Cabana about what inspired him, but we do know he had an Al Qaeda training manual, military studies in the jihad against the tyrants, and we know that he was, I think, producing ricin at home. So it may well be that they don't consider him to be an Islamist, but I think there's nothing to suggest he would be part of the far right or hard right that the government and Prevent seem to focus on. I think, therefore, a serious inquiry needs to look at whether Prevent are actually fit for purpose. Are they focusing on the wrong things? Are they ignoring clear warning signs they seem to have in this case? 3 referrals and a pattern of dangerous behaviour clearly should have triggered some more significant intervention.
So we have an institutional failing there, perhaps an inability to recognise or understand what kind of terror this was. But of course, one of the significant things, in fact, this morning as we're speaking about this, is that Keir Starmer has come out and said that this attack was terror-related. And of course, at the time, it was very swiftly denied by police and generally that it was terror-related. And so, well, what is the significance of that admission?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is significant for a number of reasons. The initial response of the state was to push this British-born Welsh choir boy angle and to tell us it wasn't terror-related. There's no reason to think it was terror-related. And at the time, I think people intuited correctly that the narrative was simply not true. They got details wrong, and there were, we'll talk about some of these cases. There were people sort of saying that the murderer was, a recent arrival and an asylum seeker, this sort of thing. But I think people knew they were being lied to, or knew they were being deceived. And that is where I believe quite a substantial part of the anger came from. And now that Keir Starmer has acknowledged this terror link, what's interesting is there's been quite a concerted effort to insist that this couldn't possibly have been disclosed before this point because it might have prejudiced the trial and that sort of thing. And that's just not true. There's I think a cohort of people who will insist that the rules really matter and must be followed when it's convenient to them, but they don't worry about the rest of the time. And if we talk about the other historic things, there were like when Joe Cox was murdered, that was labelled as a terror attack very quickly. Keith Palmer, attacks on Westminster Bridge, the guy who drove his van into a mosque. These attacks were all labelled as terror pretty quickly, and there is no reason to believe that it is a like in any way preventing prosecution to say something's terror related or believed to be terror related. So just don't think that stands up, and therefore the Prime Minister and the government more generally have to justify why they didn't say this at the time and why they were pushing quite a different narrative.
Because there's a particular question there, isn't there, given even what the government itself has done, because in the autumn it was revealed that he'd been charged with having the Al-Qaeda manual and with preparing ricin, and those could be revealed to the public without prejudicing the trial. But most likely those things would have been known about within days, if not hours, of the attack having taken place. And it wasn't contempt of court in the autumn, and so why would it have been contempt of court at that time? It doesn't really add up, does it?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know the exact timeline, but I can't imagine the police took long to search his home. And when they found that evidence, that would have been reported up, and I'm sure the Home Secretary would have been made aware of it very quickly. So certainly, during the riots, when the PM and the Home Secretary were getting on TV to talk about it, they would have known about that evidence. And I think they would have been able to mention it sooner.
And so one of the contrasts that I've been trying to point out, actually, is the fact that there was this supposed great concern not to prejudice the trial of the attacker, and yet there was absolutely no concern showed not to prejudice the trials of many of the people who were subsequently arrested for things that were happening up and down the country. And a lot of this came from the political narrative that was being put forward by Starmer and others about what was going on in these disturbances and what they were motivated by he's saying they were far right and things like this. But just tell us a bit about that political narrative.
Sure. So I think, your viewers may remember this, the conversations were around the idea that, organised gangs of neo-Nazis and far-right and hard-right people were bussing around the country to take advantage of this by rioting. And that was just not true. The people protesting, the people who've been prosecuted and in some cases imprisoned are generally, in almost every case, local to the areas where they were involved in disorder. So it wasn't people being bussed around the country. The claims, the sort of organised, hard right extremists that were plotting to launch some kind of organised rioting or insurrection or whatever is just not real. And similarly, I think the way that the PM referred to people essentially to find anyone who was not responding in the state-approved way to these events was pretty grim as well. I recall when he was booed, wasn't he, when he went to Southport?
How many more children have died in our streets, Prime Minister?
And his response seemed to be quite angry. This was disrespecting the families. And I think there's a real classism inherent in this, which is that if you complain in an approved way, if you express things in the approved way that middle-class people, that lawyers, politicians, that find acceptable, then that's okay. But if you express feelings in different ways, that can be a problem. It might even be criminalised. I saw this when I was a prisoner. I'm unusual. I was unusual in prison for my accent. And I found that I was often treated much, much better by staff and by prisoners because of my class. And I would be listened to by officers and be able to get things which let's say like a working class white man or a working class black man wouldn't, even though we were asking for the same reasonable things, simply because I communicated in a way which was deemed acceptable by those with power. And I think you see some of this here, the people booing Keir Starmer were not booing the families, the victims. And I think, we often hear these cries to not politicize things, to not, which I think is bizarre because, of course, the circumstances in which, an extreme violent man has been left free and able to murder young girls is political because it's intimately connected with political choices and policy choices and the functioning or not or lack of functioning of different arms of the state. So, I think there was this reluctance to even hear the cries of anger and of pain in the first place. And then we've got to remember that the towns where we saw the rioting are, broadly speaking, towns and cities which have been left behind for decades. They are places which have seen significant relative economic decline, arguably going back to the Thatcher era, and it's happened under Tory government and then Labour government and then Tory government and Labour government again. So these areas are really kind of forgotten, and in many cases these are the places that voted for Brexit. And I think Brexit, in lots of places, was a desire to be heard, to be listened to have capacity to affect their own futures, certainly in some of those places. So I think when we look at this disorder and rioting, we should see it as communication, and that's not to say that it's all okay or that, as I said, some of the acts were really violent and dangerous. And I think there are plenty of people who have rightfully been jailed as a result. If you're going to try and burn down hotels that have people in them, you have clearly crossed a line. But there seems to have been throughout this a refusal to actually hear the underlying message and just to dismiss and shut down and say no. And that, combined with the fact that the government was clearly not being transparent and not being frank with people about who they'd arrested or what was going on, I think I just don't think that's a good way of leading a country. Keir Starmer is the Prime Minister, and part of that job is to actually empathise with and understand the citizens of this country, even the ones who don't, write columns or have blogs or he meets in London. And I do not believe he is doing that.
Yes, and so to push that point a little bit further, one of the things that I was very struck by during the riots, it was actually Starmer's very first speech about it. Right at the start of that speech, the first thing he says, well, we'll just play it actually.
A country coming to terms with an attack so inexplicably vile that fear is an understandable reaction.
Fear is an understandable reaction, he says, but not anger. And I think that's key, because there were really good reasons to be angry. We know that there was a big state failure here. These beautiful little girls were dead. It was an appalling attack. Of course people were angry, and it was a completely understandable reaction, but he didn't make any space for it.
Yeah, and I think this idea that we're not allowed to be angry is just nonsense, right? Yeah, I think if you aren't angry that the state has completely failed and this young man has been left free to murder and attempt to murder young girls. Yeah, if you're not angry about it, I think you are. I think it's a strange reaction. I think anger is an absolutely appropriate response, and the idea that there's this sort of tendency to police response, and rather than engaging with the substance, just say, "Oh no, you're saying it wrong. You're not. You're communicating this in the wrong way." And there's something very, very sinister about that. I think, this sort of policing of appropriate forms of grief, and we've seen it, in the sort of various terrorist attacks over the years, that we're allowed to feel sad. We're allowed to say we're all in this together. We're better than this. We have more in common. All this stuff, but actually, fury at the man who did this and fury at the state that allowed it to happen is a reasonable response. The first duty of a state is to protect its citizenry and to sustain safety and the rule of law. And if the state is failing to do that, it's hardly surprising that people will become angry, and it's a right and proper response in my view. It's not to say necessarily that what they do with that anger, if you go and then try to kill other people or burn things down, that is not okay. But I think anger itself is absolutely a reasonable response.
And so another part of the government response to this and of the narrative that we've been talking about is this idea that it all came from disinformation or online speech or rumours or all of the disorder. And, given what we now know, that it was terror-related, he did have an Al-Qaeda manual. Much of the speech that was online about this there were rumours. They were not technically right in the details, but they weren't that far off. They were saying it might be Islamist-related. They were saying it might be terror-related, for instance. And to give you one particular example, so the man called Wayne O'Rourke, and he was imprisoned for several years for things he said online about it. And a key part of the offence that he was convicted for 3 years was, as it's described by the BBC, alleging that the Southport attack was a terrorist attack carried out by a Muslim. Now, okay, the suspect probably wasn't a devout Muslim, it doesn't look like, but, well, in the context of what we now know about him, it's much harder to see these comments online by someone like Mr. O'Rourke as having directly caused this disorder, isn't it? Given that they were not really that far from the truth.
Yes, I think it seems strange that Wayne was charged in that situation. But I think what we also come back to here is the two-tier inconsistency, where inaccurate or even knowingly dishonest remarks are made by one group of people who are perceived as being on one side, and they are hit with the full force of the law. You contrast it with Nick Louds of Hope Not Hate, who tweeted to about 42,000 followers. And I don't know how many followers Wayne had on his social medias, but Nick certainly had a fair number at the time. And Nick, during this disorder, tweeted that a Muslim woman had been attacked with acid. Now, that turned out to not be true at all. The police came out relatively quickly and said this wasn't true. And Louds did subsequently apologise after the police denied the attack taking place. But if you think about that in the context of what was going on, that's something which wasn't true, which clearly could have provoked greater violence. The narrative there was that the far right are throwing acid on Muslim women, if I can put it crudely, and therefore you could easily see how that could have provoked substantial further disorder. And yet, as far as I know, Nick received no sanction. There was no police contact for that. Presumably because he'd say at the time he believed the information to be true, but I would assume that Wayne O'Rourke could have made the same claim. So I think a lot of this, the problem fundamentally here is we don't have, a First Amendment right in this country. Now, if we had free speech, which was, protected in the way it is, broadly speaking, in the US, we wouldn't run into these issues. But instead we have, all these limitations and criminalizations of speech, which are simply not applied consistently. Nick Lowes runs an organisation, or is senior in an organisation which receives lots of funding from the state. He's, therefore seemingly treated quite differently from, Wayne, who is just a guy mouthing off on social media. But actually, that's completely wrong. And this is where I think we don't have a kind of firm basis for speech rights in this country. And I think all this stuff really shows that actually we need to find a way of establishing a First Amendment level of speech protection in this country, because otherwise we're going to run into things like this again and again and again, where these restrictions are not used consistently and people are criminalized for, words which other people are just allowed to say. And that is wrong and unjust.
Okay, well, David Shipley, thank you very much for coming on The Sceptic.
Thanks, Laurie.
Well, things might be looking grim here, but in America, it's Trump time. The 45th and now the 47th President of the United States was inaugurated this week and immediately set about bombastically undoing every plank of the Biden agenda, and then some. Drill, baby, drill was how he announced the demolition of the Biden administration's green agenda. And when it came to the divisive social engineering of diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, Trump's pledge was that he would restore America to colorblind meritocracy. One of the major effects of this political revolution is the hammer blow it is set to deal to so-called ESG, or as it's also known, woke capitalism. In Britain, with our sky-high energy prices and stifling regulation, many will be wondering, why can't we have that here? Well, to discuss that, I'm very pleased to be joined by Fred de Fossard, who's a Director of Strategy at the Prosperity Institute, formerly the Legatum Institute, and who's a writer for publications including The Critic. Welcome to The Sceptic, Fred.
Thank you very much for having me, Laurie. Good afternoon.
Yeah, good afternoon and good to have you here. Okay, so Trump has been inaugurated and he's given this barnstorming inauguration speech. And there's two aspects of, and he's also been signing all these executive orders very rapidly. And there's two aspects of that we want to focus on today, and that's drill, baby, drill. So his energy agenda and his taking on of the DEI complex, and in particular in the American state, but also elsewhere. And so, Fred, how significant are those interventions?
They are certainly very significant. With these two executive orders issued among dozens of others yesterday, he has overturned two massive articles of faith of previous Biden administration. I suppose you could think about it, that environmentalism and DEI are the twin pillars of woke capitalism, as it were, and he's overturned them. Drill, baby, drill is a great political promise in one respect to his core his voter base, who have always supported fossil fuels, particularly the extraction of natural gas and coal. Trump loves going on about coal and protecting the American coal industry, and ending DEI, which many conservative Americans believe to be a form of anti-white male discrimination. The ending of DEI has taken effect pretty much immediately, at least in the sense that there are no more pages about diversity and inclusion on federal government websites. And with Drill Baby Drill, I think President Trump wants to reignite the fracking revolution, which many Americans believe was absolutely central to America's recovery after the financial crisis, and indeed the great divergence between the American economy and the European economy, sadly including Britain's, which has rather stagnated since 2008.
And in particular over the past 4 years.
Yeah, in particular in the last 4 years, as Britain and Germany seem to have the ignominious title of the countries competing to have the most expensive energy in the world. Look at the way the chemicals industry in both Britain and Germany has just evaporated, collapsing under the cost of high energy. Look at the mandates we're putting on our car industry. but not just from strict from high energy prices, but things like the EV mandate, the ban on combustion engine cars, which seems to be kicking in about 5 years' time. We are regulating our own industries to death by choice. And meanwhile, the newly elected president of the United States is trying to do all he can to unleash supply-side reform, cheap energy, deregulation to support American industry.
And so partly that represents a massive break from Europe and also from the policy of the Biden administration for the past 4 years, right? But in a way, not just the decisions of the Biden administration in recent years is it making a break from, but also the ESG agenda that's been actually going on for a very long amount of time and is a whole institutional structure with lots of elements to it. So, Fred, tell us a bit about the growth of ESG.
Totally right. ESG dates back decades, arguably. You could talk about things like corporate and social responsibility, triple bottom line reporting, anti-discrimination laws, even the origins of company law, I suppose. So ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance principles. Environmental largely means directing money towards things which are supposedly mitigating against climate change or reducing carbon emissions, and most importantly, restricting finances for anything which could be considered not green, so fossil fuel extraction. S, social, is very hard to define. Social kind of means anything. The S in ESG has been the Trojan horse for a huge amount of the stuff which we would consider woke, a huge amount of the diversity pushes, but also, very interestingly, a large amount of the reason why it's been hard for the defense industry to raise money, because defense companies attract a low social score, despite the fact defense companies are obviously central for any nation to defend itself. But there we go. So that has been very bad for the defense sector. And G, of course, is governance. The most reasonable of the three pillars of ESG, because governance ultimately means company law. It means filing your accounts on time and not lying. So we like G, but E and S have been very, very difficult. And they are starting to crack at the seams. And in a way, it's really interesting how the end of the pandemic, the return of interest rates, the return of inflation, essentially the return of real money, and contributed to the disillusionment of voters, because inflation affects everybody. 10% inflation in this country, 10% inflation in the United States, similar levels of inflation in Europe for a very long time. All of a sudden, these things that seem like nice to have when financial and economic gravity didn't apply are now, rather sort of punching voters in the face. And people are suddenly realizing that we are choosing to make our energy more expensive. We are choosing to put public money into subsidizing renewables through contracts of difference when they're intermittent. We have had a thing quite a few times recently called a Dunkel flute, when there's very little solar and there's very little light and there's very little wind. So it means that our forms of energy generation are really disproportionately natural gas, bit of nuclear, but our nuclear fleet is degrading. So natural gas has to pick up all the strain. And it was only very recently we were, one power plant having a little bit of hiccup away from blackouts or brownouts, whatever you want to call them, in Britain. So this whole edifice is starting to crumble. And private money has clearly seen the way the wind is blowing. In barely a week goes past without another bank pulling out of the Net Zero Banking Alliance. Larry Fink of BlackRock, essentially the architect of ESG and woke capitalism, has now disavowed the term ESG entirely. He's moved away from this kind of thing. Tech companies are closing their diversity initiatives. But rather frustratingly, while the rest of the world, particularly the American world, is moving away from this, in Britain we see shackles to the mast. We have regulators like the Financial Conduct Authority that is still intending, at least, on implementing a fresh round of diversity reporting requirements on all financial services companies. These aren't listed, publicly traded big companies either. These are fintechs and startups that have to deal in finance. And now the CEOs behind those companies, many of whom won't be taking a wage of their own, will be paying themselves in shares, will now have to spend time and money on reporting to the regulator the diversity of their staff. I thought the Financial Conduct Authority's job was to ensure we don't have another financial crisis, not mandate who companies employ. So it's a pretty gloomy time for British observers of ESG would look across the Atlantic with a lot of jealousy.
So let's come back to institutions and the FCA in a minute, but I'm interested in where this came from. And you're right, this was not a bottom-up phenomenon. So it wasn't a market-based thing. It wasn't people thinking, oh yeah, this is really efficient, I'd like to invest in this, really. And obviously we wouldn't be doing net zero as costly as it is if we were pushed to do so by simply market incentives. And so in fact it's more of a top-down phenomenon. Now you mentioned Larry Fink and people like him are actually getting away from this now, but originally, as you write in your report, it was institutional finance that created woke capitalism. So can you just expand on that dynamic a bit?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really worth exploring this dynamic between the very tops of the business world and government. I don't think this is just the fault of some shadowy elite bankers. I do think they do this hand in glove with the state, and it is largely driven by the state. We have this funny little nexus of the government, regulators, NGOs, and the largest businesses themselves. A little bit of a revolving door of people between them, particularly in the more sort of compliance end of these businesses. And they have really been the sort of hardcore ideological drivers of this. And I think, the Net Zero Banking Alliance is a great example, because this flows from agreements made at the United Nations, which are supported by research provided by very well-funded NGOs that often get their money from some of our sort of foundations, those old Quaker foundations established in the early 20th century for the betterment of mankind, now all become very wealthy based on endowment funds, dishing out money left, right, and centre to every left-wing cause imaginable. It's an almost unlimited stream of money for left-wing projects. And when you then get a state which is staffed full of people in hot to this kind of way of thinking, and the state then introduces laws like the 2008 Climate Change Act, the 2010 Equality Act, to name but a few, or the 2006 Companies Act, which is a very interesting one as well, which all of these things impose huge duties on the private sector, or on ultimately us as individuals, eroding freedom of expression, eroding freedom of association, and ultimately eroding economic and financial freedom to direct money towards political projects. And we can see it now with the things that the European Union wants to do, with the increase of climate-related disclosures in the private sector. So that amounts to things like all businesses in the goods supply chain in Europe have to start doing net zero analyses of what they produce. And that, unfortunately, means businesses even outside the European Union that sell to Europe. So if you're a widget maker in Britain, if you haven't gone out of business for your energy costs, of course, but if you're a widget maker in Britain who's selling to a European company that puts widgets together, you're going to have to fill out a net zero-related disclosure form. There is a green taxonomy, which the British government is consulting on at the moment, which essentially outsources the responsibilities of the state onto the private sector to start recording all sorts of information about how it's moving money into green things. Meanwhile, the state shows it is completely incompetent in doing its own green things, like, let's say, reviving our nuclear power fleet. I think ultimately the responsibilities to move Britain to a lower climate economy are down to things like energy supply, which is ultimately the state's responsibility. It is abdicating its own responsibility and therefore using its own regulators and big business to force these rules on the rest of us.
So in terms of understanding why this is happening, one of the criticisms that's often made of woke capitalism is that it's virtue signaling. But, how much is there in that? Because is it all hypocrisy, or are many of these people true believers and who really get their rocks off on this stuff?
That's a great question. I think the virtue signaling, hypocrisy, greenwashing argument kind of misses the truth. I think that there's a core of real serious believers. Then there's a group of people that just go along with it because that's the way the wind's blowing. Most people just do that. That's fine. That's what normal people are like. It's easy to be led, and you just follow along with the prevailing winds. And then there might be a small group of people that don't believe it, but keep their heads down, that kind of thing. But I do think that it really is driven by people that probably believe it. Although the changing political winds make a huge difference. If it wasn't for the re-election, but before that impending re-election of Donald Trump, maybe we would have seen the corporate world dig its heels in the ESG a little bit more. But I do think that once inflation hit 10%, interest rates hit 5-6%, the way in which you could deny the economic and financial gravity just ran out of road. And ultimately, in the end, these organizations, these business leaders have fiduciary duties and people aren't going to give them their money to manage if it all goes to naught.
And so there's a particular episode in this that many people will have heard about, and that's the debanking of Nigel Farage in 2023, I think. And obviously this will have come as a shock to many people and sort of seeming out of nowhere. Why did this happen? And the kind of general consensus was that it was just some errant executive somewhere who took a dislike to him. But that's not actually quite right, because this is the result of a long-standing process of something that's called de-risking, as I understand it. I'm sure you'll explain more in a second. But and that starts with de-risking from basically not giving services to criminals and organised crime and things like this, which is okay, at least fair enough. But it sort of carries on a bit, and then it's all about safeguarding a bank's or a firm's reputation in who it does business with. And then suddenly there's not a very big jump from that idea to saying, oh, well, we don't really like Nigel Farage because of his politics, because he's a bit too Brexity or doesn't like immigration very much or whatever it is. And therefore, we're not going to associate with him for politically motivated reasons.
That is totally true, because the way in which risk has been recalibrated along these sort of ESG lines, often with financial models and predictions with very green assumptions. So if you're really, really certain that we're going to have this X or Y or Z effects of climate change by N year, therefore you're going to assume that anything which doesn't immediately push towards climate change is going to be bad for your returns. So already you've decided to take a sort of political analysis of the future to base your analysis of risk on it. It's not very far jump from risk to reputation, because if you think there's a politician who might be advancing ideas which are allegedly bad for the climate, that's where the risk and reputation get muddled, and then you're essentially in territory of political, not quite persecution, but political discrimination. And I think the Farage case was fascinating because the bank just lied, which was extraordinary. They initially lied about the reason. They said, I think it was politically exposed person, that, he's snagged because he's a politician. But there are loads of political exposed persons. There are loads of politicians. Why him? That was a little bit iffy. Then they lied to Robert Peston, which was absolutely extraordinary, saying he doesn't have enough money in his account. And obviously Nigel Farage is not going to give up, and he does his subject access request, which, to listeners, if they don't know, under data protection laws, we have the right to submit a request for information about ourselves from an institution. And when he got that back, he found a treasure trove. He found that it was active discrimination, that yes, they did do a review of his account because of politically exposed person rules, but when they decided to make the decision through some kind of audit committee, they said he doesn't match with our values. But this is a bank. What values does the bank have? Coutts is an ancient private bank, which is meant to be one of the most prestigious banks in the world, which is meant to look after the money of its clients. It is completely insane for them to stray into the territory of discrimination around values, particularly, and even more so, when you remember that Coutts is in part state-owned. It was insane. And it showed two types of debanking working together, which I think are worth touching on. So there's one which is the active political prosecution debanking, so Nigel Farage, or Toby Young of the Free Speech Union, or Molly Kingsley of Us for Them, who both had their bank accounts taken away by PayPal for political reasons. I suppose not bank accounts, but payment services by PayPal, because PayPal's not a bank. And then the other type of debanking, which is the risk-based one, which is, you're a politician, therefore you're at risk of blackmail or whatever. Therefore, it's too dangerous to hold your account. We're going to cancel it for risk aversion reasons. And I do know of cases of people who have had that happen to them because they work for an MP or an MP is a family member. But again, that's kind of insane, because how on earth would the child of an MP or the person who writes letters for a backbench MP be a blackmail risk? I don't see any logical reality of that. There's never, whenever they talk about risk, they never say what the risk is and how much the risk is. The lack of quantification allows for so much obfuscation, and then the obfuscation is cover for the political prosecution, which is what happened with Nigel.
And so Coutts is an institution that it's quite astonishing, really, to think that it would be animated in its business decisions by woke ideology. And of course, we were talking about the FCA earlier, the Financial Conduct Authority. And one of the quotes from your report that really struck me as well was that it's described ESG as a golden thread throughout what they do. And I mean, that's quite extraordinary, isn't it, Fred?
That's a great point. And the report in question is called Woke Capitalism in Britain, Diagnosis, Prognosis and Cure. I wrote it last summer for Legatum Institute, when we were called Legatum Institute. Now, of course, we're called Prosperity Institute. And I think it's damaging to the economy for a couple of reasons. So one, the very headline is, it's one of the main reasons behind expensive energy in Britain. And if you don't have expensive energy, you don't have a prosperous society. because you even need cheap energy for services, because after all, our economy is becoming increasingly digital. It requires the storing and transfer of data, which actually requires a huge amount of energy to ensure data centers are running. So if you don't have cheap and abundant energy, you don't have a competitive place to hold data centers, you don't have competitive ability to run a high-tech economy, let alone an economy based on heavy industry. But if you want an economy with advanced manufacturing as well, and Britain definitely wants an economy with advanced manufacturing, you also need the heavy industry too. So everything comes back to the keystone principles of cheap energy. And ever since the 17th century, when we started discovering coal in Britain, cheap energy has been at the heart of our booms in prosperity. The first industrial revolution, coal, the second one with oil and petrol, and then the late 20th century with natural gas from the North Sea. But then the other side of it, when we talk about the golden thread, it's the way in which these kind of rules and principles have put the finger on the dial and have always subverted free markets and have always subverted actual market decisions. Earlier, I mentioned the Companies Act 2006. The Companies Act is a law which imposes on directors non-financial reporting requirements. And those non-financial reporting requirements mean they have to take due regard to sustainability, social things. This is these sorts of things. And ultimately is distracting businesses from their purpose, which is making a return for their shareholders, which is making money. And the more you put these obligations on businesses, the more, after all, you're outsourcing a government's social ambitions to the private sector, which takes time and money and energy to do. But you are distracting businesses away from their purpose, which is growing, turning a profit. Profit is good. And said, we're all downstream of this idea that, which is, it's almost subverted the idea that we should be sort of stewards of our world and custodians of our environment. I think that's a pretty standard principle that all people believe and have believed for centuries. That's why we build businesses and build homes to pass on to the next generation. But this approach to ESG is actually getting in the way of that human impulse because the government tried to do it for us.
So I know you've got a lot of proposals of how one might go about unmaking this ESG blob. And I dare say much of that was written with a more right-leaning government in mind. But just to speculate for a moment, so obviously we've got Donald Trump coming in, and could the contrast that is creating with the, drill baby drill there, and as you mentioned earlier, we're getting close to blackouts with Ed Miliband every week here. Could that set up, is there any possibility that Labour might be inclined to doing some of this themselves?
I mean, let's see. So the Chancellor is talking to regulators with their ideas for growth. As other people have said, the last people I talked to for ideas for growth were regulators themselves. These regulators are coming up with the ideas which are holding back growth. Just look at the FCA, for example. But they are clearly starting to overturn stones looking for growth. I definitely don't think we're going to be in no stone unturned territory, because there are things which are taboo for Labour, particularly around things like environmental regulations, labour regulations, all these sort of regulatory things that people on the right want to clear out the way and allow markets to solve. It's quite hard intellectually, philosophically, morally for a left-wing government to do it. But you never know. There still might be a Nixon goes to China effect. It's very interesting that the Chancellor wants to approve expansion of Heathrow and Gatwick. Will she do things to jump through hoops to show that that's actually fine for the environment? I hope so. These are airports which badly need expanding, and they are bottlenecks on growth in the British economy. So let's hope she makes some progress there, and let's hope she's able to face down the aggressive Green lobby in her own party for that. But I also wouldn't say that Britain and America are a million miles apart necessarily, or that we could never be like them. Because after all, if Trump didn't win the election, we would have a US government committed to an electric vehicle mandate, to an eventual ban on combustion engine, to net zero in various forms. Actually, the Democrats in office in places like California were doing loads of European-style green regulations. And those sort of elite Democrats in California set the tone for the National Democrat Party. So there is a large constituency of Americans that do love this kind of stuff. And that's why it's such a sort of ferocious political battle in America. I spoke to some people from Heritage Action, which is associated with the Heritage Foundation. And they've been waging legislative war at the state level of America, submitting anti-ESG bills at state legislatures all over. I think that sort of a third to half of the United States have signed up to this, which is a great victory for them, but hasn't come without a fight. That means they need to get their legislators signed up, they need to get their voters signed up, they need to win all the elections, and then they need to do this. So it's not that, Americans who elected Donald Trump and now he's doing this because Americans are inherently intensely more keen on getting rid of ESG than the British people. Maybe they might be marginally, but it's been a huge political fight. And it's not out of the bounds of possibility in Britain or Europe at all, I think, particularly when you look at the way the wind's blowing philosophically and ideologically in our political.
I mean, we've just spoken about it, but the fact that Trump won, it's really transformed the timeline we're in, hasn't it? I mean, it would just be so different if it had been Harris.
Yeah, precisely. It's worth remembering that the Harris agenda was incredibly left-wing, particularly in terms of environment, redistribution. She was talking about taxes on unrealized gains, huge taxes on wealth. And it was probably the most left-wing platform a Democrat has run on, perhaps since McGovern in 1972, I think, but I'm no expert on American politics. So it was a very, very left-wing proposition that Harris and Waltz were putting to government. This before we even get into social policy and everything. So, the American people were making a choice, a big choice last November. And I suppose lovers of freedom and prosperity will be happy with the choice they make. Conditionally, we don't know what's going to happen. It's only day one. So we'll see what's happening. And you can sign executive orders all you want. Doesn't necessarily change things overnight. So I suppose we've got to wait and see. But many people are very optimistic.
Okay, so you mentioned prosperity there. So it was the Legatum Institute that was the former name of the institute you're at, but now it's the Prosperity Institute. So why the name change? And I suppose why is prosperity such an important thing for the world to think about right now?
Thank you for asking. So the Legatum Institute was founded in 2007, and it was a think tank always devoted to finding out, the secret scenes of national prosperity. What is it that makes nations rich? Our flagship product for many years was the Local Prosperity Index, which currently has been paused, but it's going to be revived next year with an all-senior dancing, radically new approach. And in that spirit, we thought, well, this is the moment to basically sort of reorient or reestablish our mission around prosperity. It's a guiding principle in everything we do, whether we're talking about social policy, cultural policy, economic stuff, civil service reform, constitutional reform. I think are ultimately driven towards prosperity. Why is it that Conservatives in Britain want to or should be interested in constitutional reform? It's because we need to remember that the government is the servant of the British people, and democracy is a vital engine of prosperity. We do not have a government which is the servant of the British people, one which is, where we do have the proper rule by law, not rule by lawyers, a bureaucracy which is democratically accountable, a state which actually takes care of the public finances and believes in the stewardship of the public finances, not extracting as much money as possible from its voters. We don't get prosperity. So I think with that sort of guiding spirit and principle in mind, it's a very useful one to have. And it is also a way of breaking things like constitutional reform out of the ivory tower, because I don't want to do constitutional reform just for the whole purpose of, we need to abolish the Supreme Court and return to the law lords for the sake of it, for like just aesthetic reasons. It's about the restoration of democracy throughout all our institutions.
Okay, so finally, if someone's in a party on the right and they want to unmake the ESG blob, what are the key things that they should be doing?
Right, so the advantage we have to a certain extent is a lot can be done with secondary powers, which are called statutory instruments. You don't need to do a whole act of parliament. You don't need to reinvent the wheel. Lots of these things, the government has the power as it is right now to undo. In a way, it's the British version of an executive order, like President Trump signed yesterday. So, for example, let's take reporting requirements, all the non-financial reporting requirements. If you wanted to stop all businesses having gender pay gap reporting, which I think we should do in the interests of freedom of association, you can change that by using powers in the Equality Act, like that. Done. If you want to stop non-financial reporting requirements, the financial institutions have to do, that large businesses have to do, you can do that under powers in the Companies Act, 2006. Again, done. Single vote in Parliament needed. If you want to stop the DEI capture of our institutions, you don't have to repeal the Equality Act, as much as I think we should repeal the Equality Act. That takes a bit of time. You can disapply the public sector equality duty from any public body with one vote, another statutory instrument. So you could feasibly write a statutory instrument which says, I will disapply all public bodies from the public sector equality duty. No, done. If that's too controversial, then you start with the more obvious ones. We should obviously not have the armed forces follow the public sector equality duty. Yet they do. That would be a good test case. Push that one out there. And my favourite bogeyman, the Financial Conduct Authority. This is a regulator which is paid for by industry as well. So is it sort of half public body, half not, but appointed by the government, whose job is to stop the financial crisis. Why on earth are they following equality laws? And why on earth are they telling private companies who to hire? Get rid of it. These are the sort of things we can do. There's obviously more, and in time a government which wants to do this would have to do bigger pieces of legislation, chunkier pieces of legislation. But it is encouraging that actually you can do lots of small things quite quickly.
Okay, well, Fred de Fossard, thank you very much for coming on The Sceptic.
My pleasure. Thank you very much. Laurie.
Some scandals are so massive they can take down an entire regime. In the Soviet Union, it was the Chernobyl nuclear disaster. Their planned economy couldn't afford the proper safe materials for their nuclear fuel rods. And when the reactor exploded, officials lied and covered it up. In Britain, the grooming gangs are a decades-long atrocity that have largely been covered up by our system, and the scale of which is only now slowly being realised. Could that take down our present regime of multiculturalism too? Well, to discuss that, I'm very pleased to be joined by Ed West, who's a historian and author of books including Small Men on the Wrong Side of History and author of the Substack, The Wrong Side of History. Welcome to The Sceptic, Ed.
Thanks very much for having me. As you notice, I'm actually in one of my children's bedrooms, so that's why I don't have a Stranger Things poster in my own office. I actually have an office. So.
But it's a fantastic background, and we're all very pleased to see it, although this will be quite a dark topic, so it's a bit of a contrast. But there we go. So you've written a very interesting piece on your Substack this week, Ed, which is basically saying that the grooming gangs could well be Britain's Chernobyl. And so there's a lot of different aspects to this, but I think one of the key things is that the grooming gangs are not like the infected blood scandal, the post office scandal, or something like this, where it's just an institution trying to protect itself, but rather it's the whole almost ruling ideology of our system of kind of anti-racism, of multiculturalism, whatever you want to call it, is implicated in this scandal because it was the reason that many officials and many others were sort of trying to look away from this and had no motivation to go after and to stop this appalling crime that was going on. So and that's that's the parallel there. I mean, tell us a bit more about your argument.
Well, it's the article was written. So I quoted at length an article on the Morgoth Substack, which I've just started following a couple of weeks ago, maybe. And the arguments were, his basic argument was that Chernobyl disaster was about communism. It wasn't about the safety of nuclear power plants. It was deeply rooted in how the communist system worked, from the materials they bought, which had a problem, to the cover-up, which made things worse. Likewise, the response to the grooming gangs by police, social workers, and other members of the state was very linked to the ruling sort of ideology of our system, which you might call multiculturalism or anti-racism or equity. But however you describe it, there were strong incentives in place for.
That's the end of the free part of the podcast. If you'd like to listen to the bonus interview, you'll need to become a regular donor to the Daily Sceptic. For as little as £5 a month, not only will you be able to watch or listen to the whole podcast, you'll also be able to access articles behind our paywall and join our discussion forum on Discord, where you'll have an opportunity to discuss the latest content on the Daily Sceptic with other donors, members of the editorial team, and some of your favourite contributors. Once you've become a donor, log in to the Daily Sceptic using the same email, and you'll find a link to the premium version of the podcast on the homepage, including instructions about how to listen to it on your favourite podcasting app. Remember, you can access all this bonus content for as little as £5 a month. Just go to dailyskeptic.org/donate.